Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the talk to be given by Hallam Stevens, our old friend at the Institute. Hallam is historian of science and technology, specializing in the history of life sciences and the history of information technology, particularly in the Asian context. Most important of all for us, he is a co-collaborator of the Institute's collaborative research-funded project, Making Modernity in East Asia, since 2017. Hallam's work crosses between history and anthropology, and he has published books and articles on the political and social impacts of the artificial intelligence, big data, genomics, and surveillance technologies, particularly in the Asian context. His role in the Institute's CRF, of which I was the principal coordinator, however, is in our sub-project on food studies, so it shows the wide range of research interests he has. After studying physics and the history of physics as an undergraduate, Hallam Stevens pursued MPhil in the history and philosophy of science at Cambridge University. He obtained his PhD from the Department of History of Science at Harvard in 2010 and moved to Singapore in 2011 and where he taught at the Nanyang University of Science and Technology in Singapore until very recently, where he moved back to Australia, where he grew up. He now teaches at the College of Arts, Society and Education at James Cook University in Townsville, Australia. So he just flew to Hong Kong from Australia. He's the author of several important books on STS books, books on science, technology, and society. The first one is Life Out of Sequence, a data-driven history of bioinformatics, published in 2013. This book examines the transformational role of computers and databases in recent biology. Another book called Biotechnology and Society, an Introduction, was published by University of Chicago Press in 2016. And he is also the co-editor of Post-Genomics, Perspectives on Biology After the Genome, published by Duke in 2015. He is currently completing a book about the rise of life sciences in China, so it shows his very deep knowledge about in the field of biosciences in Asia. Today's talk is entitled Fairchildren and Factory Girls, Gender, Family, and Space in the Singapore Electronics Industry. I think the title is very intriguing, and I'm sure that it will be extremely inspiring for all of us here. So please join me in welcoming Professor Hallam Stevens.
Thanks, Angela. Thanks for the invitation to be here. Yeah, it's nice to be back after such a long time, and thanks everyone for coming. So yeah, this is a new project for me that I'm going to share with you today. Yeah, a little bit of a kind of deviation from a lot of my work, which is, as Angela said, about the biosciences. This is part of a broader project that is about the development of the semiconductor industry and the kind of electronics industries. And in particular, I'm interested in the kind of globalization of these industries. So I think that, I mean, as probably many of you know, I think historically we know quite a bit about the beginning of the semiconductor and electronics industries. There's a lot of work on the history of Silicon Valley. And I think also, to some extent, I think we're learning more and more about the kind of more recent end of that story, right? That ends close to here, right, in China, and in the Silicon Valley of China, and with this, a lot of the stories of electronics manufacturing in the last couple of decades. But I think there's a kind of missing middle to this story, and the missing middle, I think it is in various places, but I think one of the places where this missing middle is in Southeast Asia. And so really I'm trying to fill in this kind of missing middle and attempt to see what we can actually learn about this kind of, like, why did this industry globalize, and what were the kind of effects of this kind of globalization, and maybe perhaps more speculatively we can also say something about the patterns of globalization and why we now have, for example, a chip shortage, right? And why has this actually occurred, right? So we can learn something from this history, perhaps. So I'm going to focus specifically on Singapore in this talk. I'm going to ask some fairly simple questions about the ways in which the industry developed in Singapore. So where was it? Who was working in these industries? And what did they do, right? So in some ways, fairly straightforward, and I'm going to try to kind of link those questions, the answers to those questions together. So this is just to give you a sense of, this is kind of an old map, it's almost a decade old, but it gives you a sense of how this globalization kind of looks, right? And the ways in which the production of chips in particular, or the production of electronics with chips inside them, is a very globalized industry in which the final product kind of makes kind of laps around the world here, right? And so really, another way of putting the questions that I posed before is sort of like, why do we end up with this kind of circulation, right? Why does this has to be the way that these things are produced? And so the historical question here is really like, how do we get to this, right? Or something like this. Obviously there's kind of two poles here. There's a kind of North American pole and a kind of East Asian pole with Southeast Asia in there. You can see that Singapore or Southeast Asia plays a role in this map. Taiwan is kind of left off here, but Taiwan obviously plays a pretty major part in this as well. So this is kind of how it looks, 10 years ago, or even close to what it looks like today. But as I said, this is the result of a long process that began in the 1960s when semiconductor companies in Silicon Valley began to look really for cheap labor elsewhere, right, outside of just the kind of Bay area. And this is partly because the industry relies on fairly laborious work, especially of assembling and testing integrated circuits and other microelectronics components. One of the first places they actually went was not outside of the United States technically, but actually onto a Native American reservation. The Navajo reservation at Shiprock was one of the first places that the Fairchild Semiconductor set up a plant, and that's been documented in a very well-known article by Lisa Nakamura, who's talked about the ways in which this kind of relied on certain kinds of racialization of, again, especially women workers in the Native American reservation in the 1960s. This plant opened in 1965. But even as this was happening, these industries were also looking for other places to find cheap labor. And they had their eyes on Asia in particular as a potential place within which this could be found. Not only was this driven by a search for cheap labor, but also went along, as it had on the Navajo reservation, with a set of stereotypes, racial stereotypes about particularly women and the idea of Asian women as particularly well suited to electronics work. So nimble Asian fingers, propensity for diligence and docility were things that you see managers or potential factory bosses talking about when they talk about their reasons for coming to Asia. And this led to a real boom of investment in Asia by these companies, and you can see some of them here. Fairchild I'm going to talk about particularly today. I'm also going to talk about General Electric and Texas Instruments. But you can see it's not just Southeast Asia, it includes Hong Kong, it includes South Korea, it includes Taiwan, it includes a little bit later Malaysia, Thailand, and so really this is a kind of very rapid kind of spreading of this work into East and Southeast Asia. An additional part of this story is also that the governments of many of these nations were very keen for these companies to come and sort of competed, offering tax incentives, sometimes rent-free buildings, or subsidized buildings, right, to actually attract these companies to come to their various regions. So the examples that I'm going to take here are about Singapore, obviously, and I want to first talk about this particular factory. Singapore became particularly attractive in the late 1960s. As you can see from the previous slide, it wasn't the first place that these companies went in Asia. But it became particularly attractive partly because of various kind of Cold War related reasons. So South Korea in particular was plagued by all kinds of strikes. Hong Kong, actually one of the factories here was attacked by Red Guards. There was perceived problems with factories elsewhere in Asia. Singapore seemed, by contrast, to offer a very stable kind of place. And the government kind of promised certain kinds of stability with very tight control over the labor market. And so Fairchild Semiconductor was actually offered a pretty good deal. So this factory was built, it was opened in 1969, and it was completely built by the Singapore government. It cost $4 million, and basically the Singapore government said, we'll build it for you. So they took the risk, and the idea was Fairchild would kind of rent it from, it was a purpose-built factory, but Fairchild would rent it from the Singapore government, and that would kind of pay back the government's investment in the building. So this is actually, it was a very kind of modern factory at the time. It's in a town called Toa Payoh, which I'll talk about in a minute. As you can see there, well, you can't really see it, goes back a fair way. It was 20,000 square meters. It had 2 stories. And so this is a pretty significant operation at the time. It held administrative offices and an assembly line on the ground floor, as well as a canteen and a kind of workshop. And was one of the first factories in Singapore also to be air conditioned because of the electronics components were quite obviously fairly sensitive to moisture in the air. So one of the so this is where I get into the question about where were these factories located. So this is a map of the town of Toa Payoh in Singapore, and one of the things I want to talk about here is the relationship between the development of these factories and the kind of newly emerging urban space of Singapore. And you can see, well, I think pretty clearly here that sort of interestingly, Fairchild Semiconductor is kind of right in the middle, right? And the town is kind of organized around it. And this is very much on purpose. And then you can actually see right at the top there's actually still electronics industries in this town. They're still operating. Fairchild is not operating. But ST Microelectronics and General Magnetics are still operating today, now pushed a little bit out to the edge. So this is significant because Toa Payoh was the first so-called new town that was developed entirely by the Singapore government in the kind of post-colonial period. And these new towns were aimed, these new developments, high-rise developments, were aimed, so here you can actually see it. This is the town going up, Toa itself, 1967. So it was designed to solve Singapore's housing problems, right? Find housing for its people, but also serve as kind of model townships for living and working. These were supposed to be removed from the city centre, right? So they weren't supposed to be right in the middle of the city, so it would get people out of the city, but make them very well connected to sort of transportation that could bring them to other parts of the city, to jobs. So it's a kind of paradigmatic example of 1960s city planning. But the new towns also inscribed a particular vision of family and gender. And I quote here on the slide Liu Tai Ker, who was one of the principal Singapore planners of new towns. So he says, theoretically, the household head can work, the housewife can shop, and the children can be educated to the pre-university level within the new town. Right? So it's supposed to be this kind of self-contained space that is housing the kind of nuclear family, the sort of ideal nuclear family of Singapore, living and working within this space. As I said, this is the first one that was completely built by Singapore itself, by the Housing and Development Board, and it became the first instantiation of what they called the neighborhood principle, which is this idea of kind of a town center with the kind of neighborhoods kind of around it, right? That would provide all kinds of social spaces and recreation spaces, shopping spaces for the residents, as well as transportation and kind of communal facilities for the town. So it's a living and working and kind of recreation space. So to place the factory, the Fairchild factory, right into the middle of this town fit squarely within this plan. Rather than residents traveling out of the town for their jobs, they could simply walk right into the town centre. This reduced congestion in the city, but it also completed the plan of making the new town a kind of self-contained version of Singapore family life. So I have the new town as one example, and that was one place where electronics factories went, but there was actually a second space in which kind of Singapore created for these electronics industries, and this is the so-called flattered factories. And as far as I've been able to gather, or they haven't managed to get much information about this, maybe there's someone here who can help me, that this is actually an idea that's borrowed from Hong Kong. So Hong Kong, they take this example, and the idea is that these are spaces that are kind of for rent. They're generic spaces, unlike Fairchild, which was purpose-built. These are basically empty shell kind of factories, which a tenant can come in and rent, right, and turn them to whatever purpose they want, right? So they're like a flat that you can rent out, but they're a factory space. They're relatively cheap. They're designed for light industries, and they could also be built relatively close to the city centre. So they had something in common with the purpose-built factories in the new town in that they could be very close to where workers lived. But they were actually separate and sort of worked around small industrial estates that were designed to house kind of little enclaves of interdependent or related businesses. The one that I want to kind of talk about here is an industrial estate that began to be developed in 1963, so that's just before Singapore actually gets a full independence, which is in the Hallam Basin. So this is actually where two rivers in Singapore come together, and they actually, the Singapore government, or the this is a complicated sort of decolonization process at this point, right? But basically, in any case, so Toa Payoh, they need to flatten in order to make the new town. So they take all the earth and they basically dump it in the swamp here at the confluence of these rivers and fill it up to make this industrial estate. So they basically transfer literally the dirt from sort of down the road, and they create 388 acres of new land, which they devote to this new kind of area for light industry. I didn't talk about this too much in the case of Topaio, but also there, as well as here, this involves the displacement of lots and lots of people who are actually living in these places, and in some cases resisting being moved out. The kampong, or village dwellers who lived in the tidal basin, were then resettled into these, sometimes forcibly, into these new towns. Interestingly, this particular place in the Kallang Basin had been a particular thorn in the government's side. It was a hotbed of left-wing political activity, and the area was, quote, notorious for smuggling, illicit distilling, and opium processing. It being an easy matter to dispose of any incriminating goods or equipment into the water, that is, throwing it into the river, whenever customs raiding parties turned up. So the filling in of this basin actually served the purpose of eliminating all of these problems of vice, as well as providing, obviously, space for industrial development. So this illicit work was then, of course, replaced by a lot of electronics companies. So General Electric moved into the Kallang Basin, Texas Instruments moved into the Kallang Basin. What I want to show here is, again, how much this was about locating these spaces close to workers, right? So the map on the left actually shows how close the Kallang Basin was to the city center. And again, the idea was to put these light industrial estates close to the city, right? So close to where people lived, but not in the city, right? So you kind of try to move people sort of out of their work out of the city. They did build some housing within these industrial estates as well. That's a little bit more of a complicated story. But also, part of the strategy here was to create transport links between the new towns and these new industrial estates. So the blue highlighted area down there is basically where this industrial estate is. This is like a contemporary Google Maps. And you can see Topaio is basically that circle up there on the left. And interestingly, the very first section of highway that was ever built in Singapore, which is now the Pan Island Expressway, which goes all the way from the airport to my old job at NTU. The very first section was this section here that linked the new town to the industrial estate. So again, the industrial estates fitted with flatted factories fit into Singapore's broader plans for shaping its urban space. This disruptive transformation went hand in hand with the transformation of labor into more regimented, disciplined, and legible forms of work. And that's sort of what I'm going to talk about. Now, who was actually working there, and what exactly were they doing? So, who was actually working at Fairchild? Who was working at GE? One of the people who has done a kind of extensive oral history of the Fairchild operation, Liu Fuk Tim, puts it very plainly. The logic of putting a factory in a housing estate was simple: to enable women to get income by giving factories the necessary labor. So this is, in fact, these factories are overwhelmingly staffed by women. Other scholars, both in the context of Southeast Asia and elsewhere, have documented how the employment of women in this kind of factory work allowed companies like Fairchild to recruit cheap and flexible workforce. Women were paid significantly less than men, but they could also be deployed more easily into shift work and part-time work. If you had factories that were very distant from home, this was a problem because women would have to be further away from their families, and also it was considered unsafe for them to travel long distances on public transport. And so part of this bringing of the factory is closer to the home was actually also to enable women in particular to make them kind of able to go to these jobs. So I'm going to divide my discussion of kind of who these women were and their work into kind of two categories here, because this is actually how they were divided by the people who ran these factories, right? So they talked about, first of all, married women as a kind of key labor pool for these industries. And encouraged by Singapore's National Productivity Board, they targeted their advertising and recruitment at married women who were looking to supplement their family income, right? To actually, their husbands were already at work, but they wanted to make some more money. This often meant offering part-time work rather than long shifts, often to accommodate this work around childcare or domestic duties. I haven't included it so much in this talk, but there are amazing stories of women who work all night. So they would work an 11:30 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift, and then come home, cook breakfast for their children, send them off to school, take a short nap, wake up, cook the lunch for their children, go and pick them up from school, take another short nap in the afternoon, prepare dinner, have dinner with their families, and then go back to work. And this is their life, right? That they did 6 days a week for years and years and years, right? I mean, these kind of crazy stories. Gracia Tai Chi, who is president of the Pan-Pacific and Southeast Asian Women's Organization, said, married working women have to ensure that the home is not neglected. After all, their first concern should be for their husbands and children. But housewives were often also considered better workers than unmarried women or men. Some factory managers reported that housewives tended to be more reliable and hardworking, but also less choosy in their jobs. Choosy is from a quotation. Quote, young girls can change their jobs if there's a 5-cent difference in daily pay, or because of the distance, or because they have friends in another company, or because they don't like the shifts. Housewives are more consistent. They work because they have to supplement their family incomes. End quote. Married women were also more content to work the midnight to dawn shifts, going home to take care of their morning domestic duties, as I've said. So in fact, the precarity of families at this time in Singapore and the greater burden of women's responsibilities, somehow paradoxically, actually made housewives even more vulnerable to exploitation than younger women. The other kind of part of the story here is that factory work allowed married women and their families to literally buy their way into Singapore's growing prosperity. The additional income that was afforded from these factories allowed greater access to consumer goods and a burgeoning consumer lifestyle in Singapore. By 1977, Lee Kuan Yew noted how spending habits had changed in Singapore. There seemed to be less saving, with consumers spending more on shopping, including what he called quality goods and new items in supermarkets and department stores. In addition to food and clothing, home furnishings also became a significant area of spending, reflecting, as one store official commented, more young couples setting up homes. In some cases, as I've tried to show in these ads, Singapore workers were actually buying the very same items that they were making in their factory jobs. Although, of course, many of these items were bound for export, by the 1970s and early 80s, there was a growing market within Asia, including within Singapore, for goods such as radios, televisions, stereos, battery-powered toys, cameras, watches, and personal computers. And electronics factories, as you can see here, encourage such purchases, going so far as to offer goods at so-called employee discount kind of prices, or to offer such items as gifts for starting a job, right, which is what you see in these ads. It also, and perhaps is a slightly separate story, but interestingly, this income allowed Singaporeans also to buy into the HDB, the housing schemes, the public housing schemes of Singapore. So actually being able to, and often it was the income, the extra income that women earned that bumped them up into a level where they could actually afford to buy flats in these new towns, right? That then they were living near the factories where they worked to earn that money, right? So there's a sort of closing of the loop here in some sense. The possibilities for work for unmarried women were slightly different. Young single women went out to work often for slightly different reasons, less to make money for their families or their children, but rather to gain some level of financial independence for themselves. Single women often didn't make enough money to leave home or to move out of home, but it did give them disposable income and thrust them into a wider social milieu. Ultimately, new opportunities for women's work had significant effects on Singapore society. Factory work was certainly empowering for some women, but it also often placed them in vulnerable positions. And again, this is something that has been pretty well documented in the literature on women's factory work, whether it's in China or in other places, has noted that women, both married and unmarried, were subjected to a range of sexual harassment, advances from male bosses, and other forms of sexual exploitation. In most cases, the women in these positions found themselves unable to respond, right? Felt that if they raised this issue, they would be dismissed, right? And so they, for the most part, did not do much about it or were unable to do much about it. Women also, as they traveled to, from, and around factories at night, they were working often late shifts, also became victims of crimes outside the workplace. And I found these images in the sort of internal company magazine of Texas Instruments, that basically, so there are new security measures that had been implemented in order, well, you can read for yourself, right, that there was obviously a problem with people standing outside the gates and either robbing or molesting the women who were coming in and out of the factories, and that these sort of measures of new security gates and new fences were supposed to kind of solve that problem. But it seems that it was not just earthly forces that women were afraid of. In 1972, a toy factory in Toa Payoh reported incidents of hysteria, so-called hysteria among female factory workers, supposedly caused by supernatural encounters. The following year, a General Electric television factory nearby in the Kallang estate had 40 female employees struck with hysteria. These women claimed to have seen, quote, queer figures lurking inside the female toilets, leading to screaming and fainting. Other women showed signs of trance and possession, acting violently towards other staff. One woman reported that the toilets were, quote, dirty, and that if they were not clean, she would strangle other female workers. The management called a local bomo, or shaman, who came to the factory and interviewed the women and admitted, quote, most cases were merely psychological. I interviewed all cases and only 3 of them showed signs of being affected by spirits. But there's nothing to worry about. I have chased the spirits away. A government report from the Industrial Health Unit and the Ministry of Labour, this is what I have here, ruled out any chemical or physical causes and concluded that prevention of future incidents required education of the community and in raising their levels of immunity by inculcating right notions and giving basic facts and eliminating superstitions. In retrospect, it does not seem far-fetched to imagine that the women were responding to inappropriate behavior by their male colleagues and attempting to find ways to call attention to it. At the very least, the episode suggests how alienating and disruptive factory work would have been to these young women. There were also concerns about women's promiscuity, including perennial concerns about factories and factory dormitories being used as brothels. To check their perceived waywardness, young women workers, according to the government, required education. In 1973, the Family Planning Association of Singapore organized a series of, quote, lessons on gracious living, targeting women at one industrial estate between 16 and 25, particularly those who only had a primary school education. Topics would include individual responsibilities in self-improvement, marriage, and the community, as well as general patterns of conduct and family planning. One outcome they hoped would be a decrease in premarital sex. Women in factory work represented a social threat, particularly through their supposed increased sexuality made possible by the increased freedoms that work afforded. So I think both the stories about hysteria and the concerns about promiscuity suggest that women's work was disruptive both to the individual women who were actually doing the work, but also to a society that was adapting to new ways of living and working. Young, unmarried women living and working together in large numbers posed a challenge to more traditional ways and mores of family life. Ultimately, both the government and the electronics companies addressed these concerns by sort of dismissing notions of kind of the supernatural and basically sort of rationally saying this should be about education in proper behavior. I argue that these interventions were critical to the formation of new kind of modern social norms around family life. So, okay. Finally, I want to turn to thinking about what kinds of work were actually being done in these places. Of course, I mean, I've defined here the category of well, I haven't even bothered to define really the category of electronics here, and there was a very wide range of different activities going on, from assembly of transistors and semiconductor devices, printing of circuit boards, assembly of consumer electronics, quality control. But what I want to talk about here is the way in which the depictions of this work, both in images like these and also kind of textual descriptions, emphasize the neatness of women, the attention that women paid to detail, their dexterity, and their strong teamwork. Of course, again, such descriptions refer back to the kind of racial stereotypes that I mentioned at the very beginning. But electronics factories also produced such disciplined forms of labor among the women who worked there. Electronics factories were also perceived by company executives to be suitable for women. This not only meant that they provided opportunities for women to enter the workplace, but it also played a particularly important role around shaping gender norms in Singapore, generating particular perceptions of women's work. Unlike perhaps many other jobs, it required a high level of attention to detail, cleanliness, and discipline. Factory bosses deployed and ordered women's bodies in particular ways that could meet these requirements. This emphasis on cleanliness, and you can see this is from the 80s, this is a kind of quote about the ways in which this cleanliness was supposed to operate within the factories. But this emphasis on cleanliness also linked to broader efforts in Singapore to clean up society. As Gregory Clancy has documented, post-colonial Singapore maintained a preoccupation, perhaps even an obsession with cleanliness. Beginning in 1968, Operation Broomstick, as it was called, extended not only to keeping streets clean, but also extended to means sort of bodily appearance, right? This was the famous, men couldn't have long hair. You couldn't spit on the streets. There were bans on hawking in the streets, fines for littering, the gradual phasing out of animal agriculture of most forms, and the attempts to eliminate insect-borne disease were all framed in terms of hygiene and public health. Electronics then seemed to fit within this as a suitable kind of clean industry that could be proximate to where people lived, and demanded a kind of clean and hygienic workforce that could complement a kind of clean and hygienic society. Perhaps I won't talk too much about this, but I also wanted to point out here that these factories, as well as places of work, became important places of recreation for the many, mostly women who were working there. And, this was an important place outside the home that women began, and in some cases men too, began to form new kinds of social bonds through all kinds of team sports and through all kinds of ways and again, there's interestingly here, this falls very much on gender lines. There's sort of beauty contests organized for women, as well as other kinds of sports like soccer. Soccer becomes plays a particularly important role here, and I think actually some of the popularity of soccer or football in Singapore today actually stems from some of these teams that the factories had. I mean, this went to such an extent that the results of matches between electronics factories were reported daily in the newspaper, right? So it was taken very, very, very seriously. Again, just some pictures of some of the team sports so this is HP, who I haven't talked about much here, but Hewlett Packard's athletics squad there. Okay, so I'm really coming to the end here. In some ways, there are kind of, three topics here that are related to my three questions, right? One is about the effects of the electronics industries on urban space in Singapore and and sort of urbanization and urban development. Another is about its effects on kind of family life and gender norms in Singapore. And another, topic that's really about the kind of disciplining effects of the kind of work that is performed in electronics factories. But what I would like to kind of make a kind of case for here is that these are actually all inextricably linked to one another, right? That actually the construction of particular types of space for this work is linked to the formation of particular kinds of gender norms and family norms, as well as to particular forms of discipline that exist both inside and outside the factory, right? That you actually, in some sense, that these go kind of, they're made to go together, right? That you create particular forms of space that are suitable for particular kinds of work inside the factory that are also reliant on particular kinds of family and gender arrangements in the home and in the broader society. So that's, in a sense, a conclusion, right? But in a kind of broader sense, I also want to speculate a little bit about what might this tell us about the kind of more global history or the longer history of electronics industry and semiconductors. And often when, we think about why we have a chip shortage or, why this industry is kind of situated in the way it is, we often talk, I think people often talk about this in terms of kind of technical and financial factors, right? That actually it's very expensive and it takes a long time to build a new chip fab lab, right? And so therefore we can't just kind of, we can't just build a new one in Singapore, we can't just build a new one in Australia. It's going to take 5 years to set up, and there's too much capital involved. So, we think about this in terms of kind of technical factors and financial or economic factors. But I want to suggest that this story of mine here indicates that there might be a kind of something like a social or cultural component to this as well. That in fact, maybe this is about that it's not only about producing factories, right? And it's not only about producing or needing capital, but it's also about needing particular kinds of workers and needing, in fact, more than that, particular kinds of social structures within which those workers exist, right? So this is not just about kind of cheap labor. It's also about producing particular kinds of people to do the kinds of work that is needed to be done. So zones of electronics production, I might say, are cultured and need to be cultured and gendered in particular ways. And I think, we've actually, to return to thinking about places, close to here, right, in China, I think we've seen the ways in which there are similar kinds of patterns in places like the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone, right, where, again, we have many, many young women who are working in factories, and that this is made possible by particular kind of, in that case, by particular kinds of social arrangements that were very specific to the setting up of the special economic zone that occurred within particular legal and financial and frameworks, right? So there is a kind of zoning that took place that made a particular kind of work, particular kinds of work and particular kinds of exploitation possible. And I want to suggest here that perhaps what we can see happening in Singapore is also a kind of zoning in a sense, right? That we might see it as a kind of zoning. This was not just the outsourcing of production from the US to Asia, but it was about creating a particular kind of spatial and cultural conditions within Singapore within which electronics manufacturing could flourish. And again, this included particular kinds of gender norms, particular kinds of family life, and particular ways of living and working that were closely linked to factory work. Again, I think that's a point to end, but I'll say one more thing, which is that actually now Singapore has, this kind of zoning, if we take that seriously, is something that Singapore has also begun with the help of multinational companies to export. So this is kind of microelectronics industry, more or less today in Southeast Asia. But what's kind of hidden in this picture is that Infineon, for example, has its headquarters in Toa Payoh in Singapore, but actually its factories in the proximate Indonesian islands of Batam and Bintan. So they have created, in fact, other zones offshore from Singapore where this work is now done. So the globalization of chip manufacturing, again, is not just a story of building factories or sort of engineering expertise, but a story about producing and reproducing particular kinds of workers and particular kinds of work, and even particular kinds of social and disciplinary formations upon which a large degree of microelectronics production relies. Thank you very much to the National Heritage Board, who has funded this work, and also to my research assistants, Queenie Ng, Aisha Damil, and Haida Sarudin. And thanks for listening.
Would you like
Should I sit here?
For the Q&A session?
Yeah.
So, thank you very much for the very interesting talk on electronic industry in Singapore and the women and the zoning. It sounds somewhat similar to Hong Kong experience and somewhat different. And I think that's interesting. And also, since I have lived in Taiwan, and there's something resonant about the Taiwan experience as well. So I think we are ready for questions for Hallam Stevens. Any question from the floor? Rindong?
Hi, thank you for this talk. I have a general question about the issue of ethnicity and nationality within this semiconductor production system. The first one is I noticed that in the paper, the medical paper, you took a screenshot over there. It mentions that those women are mostly Malay. So I was wondering what kind of ethnic composition of those women workers. Are they mostly Malay or Chinese or other ethnicities?
Yeah, so it varies. This is an interesting question. So it is also, I mean, as you may know, Singapore is about 75% ethnic Chinese and about 15%, about 70% ethnic Chinese and about 15% ethnic Malay, and about 10% ethnic Indian. And it does vary. So it does vary a bit from factory to factory, right? And so often, because of the kinds of nature of this work, it was sort of mentioned a bit that people often, especially young women, want to work where their friends work. Often you would go to work where you had maybe, your sister worked or your aunt worked there already. That's often how people got jobs. And so it did tend to be the case that women self-segregated by ethnicity. So this particular case here was a case of a factory that was mostly Malay women. And I guess that's why they in fact called a BOMO, right, which is a kind of Malay kind of shaman, basically, right? In this particular case, but there were other cases of Chinese workers as well who, again, underwent kind of similar sort of episodes of hysteria, right? And this happened in Malaysia as well, right? So it wasn't limited to Singapore. So it was not just one incident. This has kind of happened multiple times. But absolutely right that there is a kind of ethnic component to this here that is really about sort of patterns of family, I think, and how these networks worked. And I think the factories were also quite happy for that to happen, because it meant that people would work well as a team if they knew each other. And yeah, I think it had benefits for the companies as well. Right? Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, I have another question related to this one. So I remember in the case of China and early foreign investment in Chinese semiconductor industry, there was a kind of triangle relationship where, for example, a Japanese factory is managed by Taiwanese managers, and they use Chinese workers. So I was wondering if there's any such like middle manager level in these Singaporean factories that are from other countries, not from the United States, but using other countries' managers within this.
So not from the United States.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so I didn't talk about Japan. I mean, Japan also comes here into the picture here, but a little bit later. But I don't really talk about it in this paper. I don't think so. I mean, basically, my understanding of this, and in fact, this is the subject of another paper that I'm writing about, is the relationship between the Singapore education system and these electronics factories. And I'm still in the very early stages of sketching this out, but my basic understanding is that the electronics industry also produces a great demand for essentially middle management and engineering type middle management that basically, is very important for kind of the kind of consolidation of like my former employee, like Nanyang, what becomes Nanyang Technological University later on, right? So there is a relationship between the educational so I think, to answer your question, I think it begins with a lot of American middle management, but then I think they're gradually replaced by local engineers and middle managers. That's my sense, but I don't fully have an answer to that yet. But that's what I imagine. I don't see third countries here. I mean, what happens a little bit later is that actually the workers, I mean, this happens even now, that a lot of these factories where they still exist are employing not just ethnic Malays, but Malaysian Malays. So it's actually their migrant workers actually in these factories now, right? So that's where you get the story about another country is really here. I think it's more with the sort of assembly line workers get actually, Singaporeans leave that, move on to other jobs, and they're replaced by migrant workers of various forms from mostly Indonesia and Malaysia. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the really interesting talk. I was wondering whether you could talk a bit more about sort of what was on the last slide. So basically how these chip zones or electronic zones actually are transplanted to other places. Because I guess, well, on the one hand side, what do they leave behind and what happens to these spaces? I mean, you mentioned, for example, that Fairchild has moved on, but electronics still seems to be there. But also how do these, well, both the companies, but also the governments that want to draw in these companies, how do they kind of assess where to kind of establish a new kind of chip zone? And I'm thinking about this in particular because, of course, now the whole discussion is that kind of deglobalization, national security comes in, and now these TSMC is supposed to establish a factory in the US, and I'm wondering whether they will be able to actually establish a chip zone or such there. So yeah, just sort of what is left behind, and how do people manage and decide where to actually go with their transplant these chip zones?
Yeah. Yeah, good, interesting questions. What is left, maybe I'll start with what is left behind and then say something about where they go next, or how they decide where to go next. So what is left behind is often so often the factories themselves are, basically that Jackson's is what's become, the Fairchild factory is now, it's still there, it's still operating as some kind of business or set of businesses, but I believe it's basically been turned into kind of office, fairly boring kind of office space. It's not operating as a factory anymore. And I think this has happened to quite a lot of these spaces. In Singapore, that often get knocked down and redeveloped, right? Because of Singapore. But there are electronics factories. There is still a significant microelectronics industry in Singapore as well, right? Even though some factories have, like that particular one has moved on. My sense is that, that it becoming an office is kind of, that actually makes a lot of sense, because I think what actually happens is that Singapore has attempted, the policy has been very deliberate to replace kind of manual labor type, assembly type jobs with more white collar, kind of moving up the value chain. Kind of, this is the idea, and this has been a very deliberate policy. So the idea that you move from low value assembly to higher value industries that might include the same companies, but now doing the, you've got the business development office, and you've got the marketing people, and you've got the design engineers, but not the actual factories, right? The factories have been pushed somewhere else, right? But you have, or maybe in some cases the companies are left entirely. So, like Hewlett-Packard, for example, has a huge presence in Singapore, but it's not doing, it's not making inkjet printers or anything like that. It's design, engineering, marketing, whatever. It's like the business. It's kind of the hub for Asia, right? And it's headquarters, I guess, right? So where do they decide to go next? Partly this is a question of kind of following cheap labor, right? That's part of it. But I think in Singapore's case, this is, again, so I'm writing another paper about this, which is actually about, so the industrial estate that I mentioned, Kallang Industrial Estate, was run by what's called the Jurong Town Corporation, or JTC, which is a kind of state-owned enterprise which became responsible in 1968 for managing and operating all these industrial estates. And so they, during the 1980s, began to do that overseas. First, they had a small investment in actually in Chiwan Port, the oil facilities over here in just next to Shenzhen there, and then since then they also Indonesia was basically the next place, and the nearby islands of Indonesia. Since then they've created these kind of technology parks in Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, India, China. There's a huge list of. So that's their entire business, right? Their business is exporting these, whatever. I call them zones, right? Their business. They're basically real estate technology park developers. Or industrial park developers, and they are very good at this, and they come with a kind of complete package that involves setting up the infrastructure, contracting, figuring out how to put the tenders out for all the buildings, right? But also comes with a set, I would argue, a set of kind of social rules almost for how to operate these things, right? And so that's I think it's very, in the case of Singapore, it's very obvious how this works. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I would like to know a little bit more about.
I think it's on. Yeah, but
how unique is the Singapore experience in this? You know, your story is really reminds me of, you know, in the 1980s, people talk about the four tigers, and Singapore is one of the tigers, and I think it's about economic development, the post-war economic development of the four places: Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, right? And I mean, all the four places have gone through a period of industrialization based on cheap labor, and there's economic takeoff, and there's a lot of similarities, but I suppose there are also unique experience in each of the four tigers, and I wonder how your story fit into this four tiger discourse and historical development, and if you see something unique about the Singapore experience which you do not find in the other three tigers, or you think it's a shared experience of the four tigers history.
yeah. So I mean, the real answer to that is I don't know yet, because I haven't done enough work. And I don't. Yeah. I mean, ultimately. Yeah, it would be probably too hard of a project for me to do the full comparison. Yeah, my sense is that there's a lot of similarities in the way that this actually developed. I mean, one of the ways in which I hope to have access to this information is through looking at there are company records from these Fairchild and Hewlett-Packard. Some of Hewlett-Packard's records burned down, but there are some company records, mostly in California, that because of the pandemic, which was always part of this project, to actually see these, and that would provide a perspective from the metropole, I guess, or whatever. But nevertheless, that would be one way to actually begin to do this comparison. But I haven't, because of pandemic and travel, I actually haven't seen those records yet. So this story is a very much kind of bottom-up kind of Singapore story. But my hunch is that, I think the very broad patterns about kind of that this is women, that these are mostly women employed in the factories, and that this involves a high degree of kind of exploitation. I think that's probably fairly standard across these, and that actually this is a story that is consistent across the Asian tigers, because it's a story of then rapid economic. I mean, all of these countries have continued to develop very rapidly. Taiwan obviously goes in Taiwan is in this story the winner in some sense, right? Because it manages to stay with the the very lucrative semiconductor industry more than Singapore does. Again, this is a story that I've yet to unpack, but what I have understood about it is that Singapore, interestingly, fails to make some critical investments when they also could have been a kind of mover in this space, but didn't actually do it. Didn't actually didn't want to gamble on the big investments that were required to invest in the semiconductor industry, and so they do have an industry, but it has remained relatively small compared to other places. So I think at some point they do diverge. I also think that probably the parts of the story about urban space are quite different in these different contexts, because Singapore is in that respect, because of its size and because of the ways in which that size has allowed it to be controlled in very specific ways. I suspect that is maybe more unique to Singapore.
The Singapore case is probably more similar to Hong Kong in terms of space.
Yeah, right. That's true. So maybe, but I think, Yeah, I mean, I think it would be interesting to see how far this comparison can, can be pushed. But I don't. This is part of a
John. John?
Sure. I'm in many ways just building on the previous questions. What you're describing here is a very stable system for that particular period. And as we dial forward, as the other questions were about, I wonder how, in a very gendered way, things progress. I guess the ones who are deemed unstable, the single women, they can marry and become more stable, I guess, from the standpoint of whoever was looking at them. But then the industry itself also moved on in very drastic ways. The pictures you're showing here for Fairchild or for National Semiconductor, those workspaces are very different from what one can expect, let's say TSMC or Chartered Semiconductor, the clean rooms. And in that sense, I think the modern semiconductor configuration is more similar to what we saw in soy sauce factories, where the female is actually unclean in many ways, right? So the bunny suit in a foundry is kind of like the big whites that we saw in China during COVID, and that's a different gendered aspect of the spaces. So back to Kassan's question, I wonder who is left behind is just as important what is left behind.
Yeah.
Right? The factories could not serve the same purpose anymore because chip companies, except for say Foxconn, the floor space would not look like what it looked like in Singapore in the late 60s and the 70s.
Right.
But then the people as well, just like you said about the training that is involved. The factory girls who worked in a chip workshop would not progress with the industry into semiconductor workers because they didn't go to NTU for the training, right? So they certainly didn't go to MIT so that they could work at TSMC.
Yeah.
So what happened to that bunch, and were they left behind? Just like the shops were left behind. I think it's quite interesting from a gender perspective how that worked. And in that same way, it happened in Hong Kong because the guys were the ones who went to PolyU or to all the more technical colleges and somehow moved on with the industry. And I wonder if we were to change perspective to other industries like textile, maybe the female workers would have done better because they become more the fashion side of things that lend themselves better in a very gendered workspace. But anyway, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, interesting. I think that do the women so I absolutely agree, the women do not progress for the most part within these companies, right? And actually, so what actually got me interested, so what actually alerted me to this whole project in the first place, interestingly, was that some of my students, I was giving lectures about the history of Silicon Valley, and I mentioned Fairchild Semiconductor, and some of my students were actually like, oh, my mother worked for that company, right? And I was like, wait, what? And then, I actually realized that, and, that there were a whole bunch of these companies in Singapore, right? So I think what that suggests, actually, is maybe that some of these women actually did go back, especially probably the younger women, right? They worked, perhaps before they were married, and then became housewives, kind of, later on when they were married, had kids, right? So they didn't remain in the workforce, right? So I think that's probably true. I at the same time, and again, I have no evidence for this, but my sense is that this does open up more. I mean, I think part of what I'm trying to argue here is this does normalize women's work, in particular in Singapore, right? I mean, but there are women who, in the long paper version of this, right? It seems like almost all of these women, their only exposure to work that they've ever had before is domestic work, right? So there's these very kind of, in some ways, very funny articles in the Straits Times saying how, oh my God, we can't find amas anymore. Like, there's nobody to mind our children, right? Because all the women have gone into these factory jobs, right? So it kind of completely, there is a sense in which this does kind of change the opportunities for women, right? That maybe, this is we can say maybe there's lots of bad things about these factories and the conditions under which they're working, but this is a change, right? And I think that at least some percentage of the women do go into other kinds of, they go into office jobs, right? And so I think it does begin to change the norms around, women's work in Singapore. That's really but it also, the problem with that is also that it normalizes the kind of dual income kind of situation where women must go out to work, right, in order to have a family life that is of an acceptable kind of, perceived to be of an acceptable standard, right? And so, I think so that's where the kind of family aspect comes in here. I think that the expectations of what a family looks like and who's working within the family are actually transformed by just this huge availability of work that is suddenly, opened up by these industries, right? And yes, some of the work goes away very quickly, right? And it's very, like, women lose this. One of the ways in which this industry is very exploitative is as soon as there's global downturn in demand, they fire all the workers and then hire them again 6 months later, and then they fire them all 3 months later. It's so some of this is very kind of almost seasonal, this work, right? So there's all kinds of problems with it, but I think it does draw women into the workplace in the long term in a more stable way, right? But not into electronics, which does disappear, right? Yeah.
Hey, thank you for the talk. It was really interesting, and I was just thinking about so many historical and contemporary comparisons, specifically with Japan, just because I know the history better. But I had a couple of questions, and I was wondering, have you thought about the anti-union movement, I guess, in the Singapore context? And one of the reasons why these leisure activities within the companies were so important is because they were anti-union. I was speaking with somebody who used to run these activities for Sony Singapore, and it was basically so that the woman wouldn't have time to be influenced by union organizers, and because union organizers would say oh, come have tea and do these fun activities, and then during that meeting they'd try to org. And so it was sort of the corporate way of trying to think about how do we get beyond unions, which kind of leads me to my question, which is, we often talk about cheap labor, but we don't actually talk about labor standards and why certain countries are better even if they might be more expensive. And so I was wondering if you could, and sort of in line with Angela's question, out of these 4 countries, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and sorry, I forgot one.
Hong Kong.
Hong Kong. If you do a comparative study of the labor standards for part-time work, right, not full-time work, and specifically within the factories, I think you'll see quite a huge variance. And I was thinking about Ling Yiping's work on cadmium poisoning in Taiwan factories, and the electronic industry, that's not semiconductor, has had huge, sort of industrial hygiene issues, right? And that's one of the reasons why Japan stopped manufacturing on the archipelago, because it was the laws were getting too strict, and it was easier to manipulate, workers abroad who they didn't care about. So I was wondering if there's that issue in a semiconductor industry, in terms of industrial hygiene and labor standards law, and thinking about night shifts, because I think we talked about this the other day, thinking about women's cycles and fertility and so it's just
okay. So the union thing is interesting. So it's a little bit surprising to me that they right. I have to look into this question about the union and the sport thing, because essentially, labor unions are kind of abolished by the late 60s in Singapore. They technically exist, but they're completely co-opted by the government, right? So there's something called the Tripartite Agreement, which is, I think, signed in 1966 even, I think, so very soon after independence. And it's basically an agreement between between the unions, companies, and the government. And it basically says there will be no more labor disputes. There's a sort of total control of the unions. They technically exist, but there is a kind of, and so what I didn't make so explicit in this paper is that when there's a whole lot of stuff, when you see the American bosses or managers come to Singapore, they use this language of sort of pliancy, like worker pliancy, right? Which is partially racialized, but I think it's also coded language for we can treat them however we want and there's nothing they can do about it because of the union situation. So I think, yeah, so I see this, and I think ultimately that is the most important reason that they come to Singapore. It has nothing to do with like Singapore will say, oh, it has to do with like the quality of our workers, it has to do with like, you know, how many tax incentives we give them, it has to do with how beautiful our country is, like all this stuff. I think it's all rubbish. Like it just has to do with the union arrangements. They just don't want the shifts to be interrupted. The factory must keep running, and that's the most important thing. And they have big problems with that elsewhere in Asia, as I said, and they, yeah, go to Singapore. But yeah, I'd be interested to hear more about this sport versus union thing. I mean, yeah, the unions exist, so it may be a way of like, yeah, they maybe still have some power at this point, but yeah. So when you say labor standards, do you mean the standard of like the output, like the product, or do you mean like the height of like the health and safety?
So labor standards, I think, evolved over like the post-war period, right? So I don't know when Singapore enacted its labor standards law, like sort of the hygiene, protection, all that kind of stuff. But for example, night work for women is oftentimes restricted. But if you look at the ILO, the International Labor Organization, women of a certain age obviously can't do night labor. And so, yeah, I was just wondering, like, the conditions, and I think you just said it, basically, no unions would make it a really attractive place for any corporations. So. Yeah,
so, so none of that is, in the 70s, is much of a concern for anyone, right? And in fact, very strangely, even though it's absolutely the case that the reason these companies are moved out of Japan and California and onto, like, Native American reservations, for example, is because of their pollutive and toxic kind of properties. But in Singapore, very strangely, and you know, to some extent this is weird on some sort of obvious level, they talk about it as being clean. That actually it's clean work, because actually the kind of dirty and polluting industries are put out into Jurong, so on the far west side of Singapore, where it's still very, you know, there's still like the petroleum refining, you know, sawmilling is a big industry out there at that time. The steel, there's a steel mill out there, which is actually run by a Japanese company. So that kind of heavy industry is totally unsuitable to be near where people live, and so it's pushed to the edge. Things like toys, textiles, electronics are considered, on the other hand, clean and non-polluting, and therefore can be in the middle of Toa Payoh or in these like industrial estates which are right near where people live and you know, live. So yeah, it is a little strange. And at what point do they kind of maybe change their mind about that? I don't know when that happens, or maybe by the time they kind of care about that, most of those industries have gone anyway, right? So yeah.
Sorry, can I just ask one more follow-up question before then I'll pass the mic? I was just thinking about taxation and thinking about how part-time work, and we call it part-time work for women who are married, right? Because technically they're housewives, which means their domestic labor is actually their full-time work. But one of the ways in which the patriarchal system and the lifetime employment system in Japan was sustained is by giving women allowance of 100 hours per week or month, I can't remember exactly. And under that, they don't really get taxed. So they're able to supplement their husband's income, but it's only for 100 hours. And if they go over that, then they get taxed heavily. So it gave housewives incentive to work, but not work too much. But it also enabled the employers to give them a much lower wage because they couldn't work that much. And so it not only reinforced the idea that the male was the breadwinner, the main breadwinner, and they were technically housewives, but it gave a huge supply of easy, cheap labor. And so I'm wondering, how did this kind of fit into the system, whether it's taxation or patriarchal or like male breadwinner idea, and if that was reinforced by having these like married women as workers as opposed to, say, single one.
Yeah, I don't think there was any difference in the way people were taxed. I mean, taxes are, as you know, are very low in Singapore anyway. I mean, income tax is very low, so that maybe is less of an issue. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is just the way that this. What's that? Yeah, I mean, I think that this is just, wages are lower, and for women, and they also, I think the protection, like job protections, are fewer, right? Actually, what job protections exist are, for men, or even, I think are totally absent for these women working in these factories, right, where they can be laid off from kind of almost from day to day, right, basically. And what's that?
Did they have the putting out system because of contracting? So that people were just doing it at home and...
No. I mean, there is, I mean, for most of these industries, there is, like a level of like equipment that is needed, and, there is a level of cleanliness within the spaces that's required, right? Like you don't want dirt and, whatever in dust inside the electronics components that you then, a lot of it is, then you seal it up. So your integrated circuit you assemble and then you seal it with epoxy, right? And so anything that's dirt or dust is sealed into the circuit, right? Which can cause problems. A lot of his work is, a lot of the really mundane work is also quality control, and that is done with a microscope often. And so a lot, I didn't have pictures of this today, but there were a lot of pictures of just the women sitting there, like they've, like white coats, hair tied back, and just looking in microscopes all day. Terrible work. But yeah, you can't do that at home, right? Yeah. So putting out.
Jill, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you so much. Really enjoyed the talk. Obviously, I could not help myself. I had to think about the chapter that you contributed to the book that we're going to launch tomorrow, right? About Singapore's predecessor, kind of in terms of the internet in the 80s. So my question is basically, you described how sort of the women go in these factories, but I wonder, like, what did they bring home? How did the presence of these industries change Singapore's relationship with technology in a very concrete sense in families? I mean, they even got subsidized sort of, or kind of cheaper technology access, and that definitely brought some change into these families. So I'd really be curious to hear about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, right, I mean, it really it changed where people were able to live, right? I think I was just reading this, like so basically when Singapore becomes independent, something like 1.15 out of 1.6 million people are deemed to be living in squats. So a huge percentage of the population, right? And maybe those figures are, there's a government figure, so, what classified as a squat, maybe somewhat questionable. But nevertheless, this ability to like very rapidly shift people into this high-rise public housing, right? But at their own expense in some sense, right? So this relies on the money that is, coming in from this kind of labor. I also think, it is, the kind of, as I said, the turn to kind of these, not just electronics appliances, but furniture, right? All of this kind of home goods type stuff, right? That actually, and I think there is a sense that, this is something that the state has provided for us, right? That not just the housing, which is very, very obvious, right? I mean, I guess that's kind of part of my argument in the paper for the book, right? That this is about that the state's provision of technology for people, right, is a critical part of their claim to legitimacy, right? And I think this, in a slightly different way, but I think there's maybe something similar going on here, right? That these access to modern kind of luxuries, or whatever you want to call them, right? The consumer items. Yeah, I mean, there is talk amongst women, and it's hard to know how much this is coming from the women themselves, or it's something that's being kind of put into their, taking their words, whatever, put into their mouths, right? Like putting words into their mouth. But there is this sense of the idea that women should be, or that women are almost, I don't know what the right word is, that it's a participation in modernity to even work in these factories, right? That this is not just helping yourself, it's not just helping the country, but it's and your family, but it's also an ability to participate in this kind of modernization of Singapore, but of the kind of global modernization, of global modernity in some sense as well, right? That being able to be in this high-tech space, right? Even if you're maybe not able to afford these products yet, right? This is something that's kind of, it's good. This is a good place to work, right? Because it's participating in this, right? And that is definitely something I've seen. To what extent it is actually representative of the women's opinion about their own work is hard to say, right? But yeah, it's there.
In relation to that, do you have any information on the age range of unmarried women in the factories? Who are the youngest? I mean, for married women, we suppose that they are at least 18, 19 or older, right? How about the unmarried women? How young could they be? Was there any issue of child labor?
Yeah, I think there are child labor laws. I think the women are generally, the youngest are 16 or 17, so they've left kind of Singapore has education, like public education for all children, up to a certain age. I mean, was it in contradiction to our system? Yeah, so this is kind of emerging at this point, right? So the Singapore state is only a couple of years old at the point where these first electronics companies are coming in. So a lot of I don't know if it's on the ads that I saw, but a lot of the ads say primary school education required. But that is reflective perhaps of the fact that some of the women at least would have been, they would have grown up under the British system, right? So it wasn't even the Singapore education system at the point when they were having an education, right? So I think, I think there maybe is a lower limit on, I don't know what exactly it is, but certainly the education is just need a primary education. I think the idea is that they will, they say they would, we will train you as long as you're a hard worker, it's fine.
Okay, thank you. Any other question for Hallam? Yes. Wyatt.
Hello, Professor. I'm very interested in the supernatural forces you mentioned in your PowerPoint. You mentioned that there are several Chinese women talked about these themes. And I wonder, most of them are Malay women, or just several women are just Chinese? Because I'm curious about the religion behind this social structure, and when they meet the modernization process like this technology industry, and how they deal with these supernatural themes. I'm very curious about how many Chinese women incorporated into this process.
You mean the kind of the supernatural kind of events, or like
Yeah.
yeah, there. I mean, I haven't actually tried to count all of these. There are a bunch of these episodes that occur not just in Singapore but in Malaysia as well. Different kind of factories. Not all of them electronics. Yeah, some of them. Yeah, I mean, they're reported in different ways, and this where the sort of cultural thing may be specific, right? I mean, there's, you know, I think maybe, you know, the people's cultural attitudes towards ghosts and kind of the supernatural obviously varies, right? And I think, so the ways in which the language in which women talk about this, maybe more kind of like ghosts in some cases. I quoted this like queer figures, right? Whatever that means is like, so and in some cases it's not even really described. It's just women break down kind of on the factory floor and like are screaming or shouting or threatening other women or, you know, running around kind of seeming like they're crazy, right? So there's different, this happens on multiple occasions over in the early 1970s, that this occurs in different ways, right? And I mean, I interpret this as, I mean, there are various ways to interpret this, right? I think it's fascinating, right? Because we see this kind of contrast between these, the kind of modernity that I was talking about a minute ago, in these these kind of factory spaces where they're making these, you know, high-tech electronics, but on the other hand, this emergence of kind of spirituality in some sense, right, in the midst of this, right? So there's this very strange kind of contrast between these two things going on, and I think I partially interpret this as a kind of, it's a form of resistance of some sort, right? Whether it's resistance in some cases maybe to sort of sexual assault, right, that may be going on in these places, or whether it's just a form of resistance to the other, you know, like the hardship of the work itself, right, and being able to actually just stop working for a while and sort of protest, right, but it comes out in a strange way. Yeah, I mean, but I think there's something to be said here about the ways in which it expresses unfamiliarity and discontent with these new forms of work, right, that are very disciplined, that are very regimented. And if you think about kind of the contrast between work in the home, right, which is, you know, like working as a nanny or an ama, right, or a domestic helper, which is what many of these women would have experienced if they'd worked at all, to being in these very regimented factory spaces where you're with strangers, right? You're with male strangers often, right? And you're supervising you, right? This is a very alienating experience. And I think that this is I think this is something that's provoking this kind of thing, right? And but it manifests in all kinds of different ways that, have to do with, I think, specific cultures.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Hello, professors. Thank you so much for your fascinating sharing. And I'm a student from the Comparative Global Studies of Education. So I'm quite interested in just how you mentioned, the relationship between the semiconductor industry and the educational system in Singapore. And as you mentioned, the female, they may gain the very much lower wages compared to male, so it may contribute to the occupational hierarchy. So maybe in the long term that will be cause the social injustice and even the global injustice as a neo-colonial form of the Anglo-American countries or some Western hegemony. So I wonder, would you like to share your opinion about how the society to maybe to improve their regulations or their laws or education systems to keep a balance between their labor force and their human capital in education to balance the social justice? Thank you so much.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, interesting question. There's a lot of different things there. I think, so first is a question about kind of, I think, gender and justice here, and I think that, so I must say I don't know a lot about this topic of education yet. I've started to collect some materials, but I don't actually have any real conclusions from it yet. My sense is that, first of all, the education is very, very gendered, right? Because it's really training engineers, right? I mean, the women, as kind of John's question indicated, kind of fall out of this industry, right? But it is men who are trained as either largely, I mean, it's not all men, but the vast majority of men trained as engineers or as kind of managers of some form, right? Often also some form of engineering training. Yeah, I think so this does create a kind of, I think there's some sort of, it does create a longer term kind of structural problem of kind of gender inequality, right? That gets built into the Singapore kind of system to some extent, right? I think maybe now that has begun to change, right? But I think it does persist for a very long time, right? And I think most of the people who have opportunities to move up within these industries in the 1980s and 1990s and then to start their own businesses, right, are men, right? So I think that's certainly the case. But was there another aspect to your question that was not just about the gender part?
Would you like to share more about the relationship between the education system in Singapore and the semiconductor industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is that actually, so Singapore, and I don't know what this is like in Hong Kong, but Singapore has a very kind of robust, what they call polytechnic system, and these are kind of pre-university qualifications. So it's considered a kind of a lesser kind of qualification than university, but they're very technical focused. And so I think one of my kind of hunches really at this point is that there is a very strong relationship between the way this whole technical education system develops and the electronics industry, right? As well as it having some kind of effect on the universities and the emphasis on engineering and on STEM within the universities, right? The real emphasis on engineering as being the way to kind of create both a future individually, but also a future for the country, right? And this is, very prevalent in Singapore, right? This idea of, the country is essentially run by engineers, right? The coupling between sort of technology, engineering, and governance is a very, very kind of close one here. So I think, in some sense, the electronics industry, I suspect, is very, very important in sort of solidifying this kind of idea of STEM and technical education as being kind of a path to success, right? And I'm thinking Singapore is not the only place where this has happened, but I think it's a good example.
Okay, I think thank you so much for this very interesting talk. I mean, interest is shown by the numerous questions that are posed to you, and we really look forward to the publication of your. Is it going to be a book or an article?
Don't know yet.
Whatever. We look forward to reading your final output. So, thank you so much, and thank you for your questions.